We're at the Getty Center in Los Angeles in the Department of Photography study room. And on this enormous table is a photograph, but it actually is a kind of documentation of a film made in the late 20s in London. It's a beautiful expression of the interest in abstraction that was so much a part of that moment.
The photograph is by Francis Bruguiere, who was an American artist, born in San Francisco, worked in New York, and then moved to London, where he made a film called Light Rhythms that this relates to. And he was quite interested in exploring light abstraction in photography and also in film.
Well, film and photography is light. It is, at its core, the fixing of light on form. And this is exactly that in its purest sense.
Artists like Bruguiere would call a work like this an absolute work because it's not mimetic. That is to say, it's not trying to reproduce something in reality or a story. It's shapes, pieces of paper that have been cut and folded. It's actually two images superimposed on each other, so it's quite elaborate.
So to understand what we're seeing, we really need to begin with the artist with a knife or a scissor, constructing these biomorphic forms, and then overlaying that with very precise lighting and shadow.
Bruguiere, for a number of years in the 1920s, was making still lifes out of cut and folded paper, creating these very elaborate three-dimensional constructions purely of white paper, which was a neutral material, and lighting the paper in different ways and photographing the still lifes. And was quite known for this particular niche in abstraction in the 1920s. But when he moves to London, he wants to take this further. So he meets a man named Oswald Blakeston, who was a film critic, an art critic, and they hatch a plan for Bruguiere to recreate these cut paper abstractions, but for the purposes of making a film, adding motion and the element of time.
Paper is something that we associate with the history of drawing, but here the artist is drawing not in pencil, but in pure light.
So the film Light Rhythms, which premiered early in 1930, was hailed as the first abstract or the first absolute film made in England. And what it consists of is a series of segments divided into movements, like a musical score. And each movement consists of 6 segments. Each segment is a different still life or 2 still lifes superimposed on each other with lights moving across the surfaces of the paper. And he does this, we think, specifically for reproduction in a magazine called The Architectural Review for an article that comes out 2 months after the film's premiere, written by Blakeston.
For me now in the 21st century, it's jarring to see these early experimental films because there is no narrative. It's a rejection of the thing that we so often look to. And I think this was seen very much as oppositional to the commercial film that was being made in Hollywood, for example.
It's turning its back on the conventions that were already established by 1930. The commercial films released, say, in 1930 have all of the formal devices and structures that we see in films made today. But a work like this doesn't partake of any of those conventions. A work like this is, again, abstract or absolute.
My mind looks at this in a sort of analytic way. I try to understand exactly what it is that I'm seeing. And clearly I see those 2 large forms and the vertical forms, but the relationship between those is so ambiguous, it's so fleeting, it's so impossible to read as forms seem to appear and disappear not only in shadow, but into each other. And at the same time, they seem to weave in and out of space, creating a sense of depth and a kind of richness that is really compelling.
Yes, it's a very complex image. One doesn't really understand the scale of it or which forms are physically connected to each other or which ones are superimposed on each other. There definitely is a sense of space and depth, and it's not any easier when you watch the actual film. It's even more complex and hypnotic and fascinating. You really get kind of drawn into the movement of the lights.
I noticed that there are little holes in the corners, And so it seems that this was probably tacked up on a wall, that this might have been a working object rather than being intended to be a work of art.
We think, based on the inscriptions and the thumbtack holes, that it was a kind of working print of some sort.
But we're so lucky to have this particular print as a vehicle back to this moment when experimental film was radically new in its rethinking of what film could be. There is this wonderfully optimistic quality here that film does not need to be a commercial activity, that it can be a fine art activity.
That's true, and there were many different artists who took up filmmaking, people who were painters and photographers, got interested and involved in film. There were film clubs, there were theaters that specifically showed art films. It was written about a great deal in various magazines and journals, and had a big impact on the art world overall.
The way in which the artist is isolating light and its qualities, and the way that form is defined by light, seems so elemental that it almost seems to me like a kind of scientific investigation. Clearly the artist is using photography, a cinema camera, there is technology involved here, but there is this wonderful way in which there's this coming together of science, of art, and of technology.